Hello, everyone. My name is Kiala Shaw, and on behalf of the Foley Institute, I will be your moderator this afternoon. This event is titled From Where I Sit, Perspectives on Race and Justice. Before we get started, I want to say thank you to our co-sponsors, Alpha Phi Sigma Criminal Justice Honor Society, Black Student Union, Black Women's Caucus, Criminal Justice Graduate Student Association, the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology, Department of Sociology, School of Languages, Cultures, and Race, the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, and the program in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Tonight, we'll be discussing the perceptions of justice varying depending on where people are positioned in the criminal justice system. The view from the bench is very different from that of the defendant's box. I'm happy to introduce our two amazing guests this afternoon. Our first guest is Judge Victoria Pratt, who is a renowned national and international advocate for reforming the criminal justice system. As a former chief judge in Newark Municipal Court in Newark, New Jersey, she spent years using techniques that increased the public's trust in the justice system. Judge Pratt recently signed a book deal with Seal Press to author her first book, Justice Her Way, about work as a reformer. And our second guest tonight is Omari Amili, an author, speaker, advocate, educator, consultant, and father from Seattle, Washington. He has published 3 books, including an autobiography titled Transforming Society's Failures and 2 children's books titled In Search of Role Models and Skin Deep. Omari has been involved in advocacy at the local, state, and federal level and has made it his personal mission to introduce new possibilities and change the narrative for individuals from backgrounds similar to his. We'll have quite a bit of time for some Q&A, so if you have any questions, please submit those in the chat or email tsfoley@wsu.edu and try to specify who you're directing your questions to. And now I will give it away to our 2 speakers.
Glad to be here. Glad to be here. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. I'm really glad to be back at the Foley Institute. Did an event a couple years ago with some friends of mine who have similar backgrounds of serving time in prison and getting out, going to college and being successful. Shout out to Dr. Noel Vest, WSU graduate, who invited us that last time. So I'm here to share with you guys my perspective on going through the system, from where I sit as a Black male, in the Pacific Northwest, which is a very, very white place. We are constantly policed by people who don't look like us, constantly prosecuted by people who don't look like us, constantly sentenced and have our court fees and fines and everything, imposed by people who don't look like us here in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm not going to say it's 100%, people who don't look like me, but that was my experience almost every time I went to the courtroom where I had interactions, and it goes even further than that, to probation officers, to the corrections officers and things like that. So, one of the first things that I noticed in my interactions with the system, being an African-American male, there were some crimes that I committed with white females, for example. And, these white females who probably should have been my co-defendants were instead treated like my victims, so I would have approached them and we would have both been, willing to commit these crimes for financial gain, right? That's the only motive for me, and that's the only motive for them, is financial gain. We both knew it was wrong. We knew that we're not supposed to be agreeing to deposit bad checks in your bank account, and you're not supposed to be agreeing to report your card stolen instead of telling the truth. Look, I gave my card and my PIN number to this guy. But when the detectives and whoever else found out about this, I'm charged with the felonies, and they are more treated like my victim. They didn't have any charges. They were able to get the money that we made and just go about their life. They didn't suffer the same collateral consequences that I had suffered from, not being able to vote for a while, not being able to own a firearm, not being able to rent a place to live, So that was one of the big things that stood out to me when, I'm still, before I even got sentenced, when I'm reading my paperwork, it's like, wow. So these guys who committed these crimes with me, they're not really being treated quite the same way that I am. We're around the same age. The only difference is I am a Black male. These guys are white females. So I noticed a big disparity there. And I also, I had a situation where I was not just arrested on the streets for these crimes. I found out that I had a warrant for my arrest, and I walked into the courtroom, turned myself in. We set up a quash hearing, and I figured that with me being so young, I was 21 years old. I had never really been in trouble before with the law. I had no criminal history. So I figured, look, by me hiring a lawyer and walking into that courtroom, I'm going to be given some type of credit for that, right? They're going to see, okay, this is a person who is addressing the situation. But instead, I was like just destroyed by the prosecutor who had never met me. And the prosecutor was a white woman. Once again, I'm an African-American male. So and the judge was also a white woman, so the people who I am sitting in front of with my life in their hands, once again, they do not look like me. They probably don't share a similar background to me, that we really just didn't have anything in common. So I felt like I was at a major disadvantage. And not only to mention that, my own attorney was a white male. So when I'm in this courtroom, I'm probably the only person of my skin tone in there. And I kind of pick up on this, and anyone in my situation is going to pick up on that. So, and this is, it might be unique to the Pacific Northwest. I've never been through the system elsewhere, but I have visited places like Atlanta and Baltimore, and just walking down the street, you can see there's a lot of African-American police officers there, for example, which you don't see too much here. You do see them, but you don't see a whole lot of that. So from my perspective, I felt really alone. I felt like it was me against everybody for the most part. There was a time where I didn't really trust my own attorney, even though I had paid him and my life is in his hands and I feel like he's representing me. I don't know what's going on behind closed doors in their conversations when I'm being told, look, you're looking at decades in prison. I had committed financially motivated crimes, and I committed a lot of them. When I found out that I had a warrant for my arrest, it was for 30 felonies at once. And what my lawyer told me was that you're looking at decades in prison for leading organized crime, even though I was not charged with that. My highest charge, which if your sentence runs concurrent, my highest charge was identity theft in the first degree, which carried a maximum of 7 years. But with being told that I'm looking at decades in prison, while I'm also sitting in jail on a 6-figure bail that I cannot bail out from because I don't have collateral. I don't have any homeowners in my family who can put their house up to get me out on this 6-figure bail. And I honestly probably wouldn't have even wanted them to anyway. Don't sign your life away, to get me out of jail. But it was a situation where I was extremely pressured to get out of it. Like, I don't know if I'm going to die in prison. I had never been to jail before, but I knew I was on my way to prison. I just didn't know how much time I was going to serve. But being told you're looking at decades and like you have a way out of that by pleading guilty as charged to all 30 felonies, I went for it, So I went from having no felony convictions to 30 felony convictions in an instant, pretty much. I sat in the county jail for 8.5 months. And there was no plea agreements being offered to me, and I thought that every single time somebody comes in there with a bunch of charges and they don't go to trial, this leads to some of those charges being dropped. That's what a plea agreement is. We're going to do this as long as you do this, right? But it ended up where I just felt like I got railroaded. I pled guilty as charged to all 30 felonies. And I will say once again, I was guilty of far more than 30 felonies. So when I say I got railroaded, it's not that I couldn't have been convicted of this many felonies. It's just that that's not the way the system quite works. The way the system works is plea agreements involve drop charges, less time, things like that, in exchange for not going to trial. But for me, being in my position, I was lost. I didn't have anybody that I felt was really fighting for me, even though I had a paid attorney. I didn't have a public defender. I paid my attorney, but I just didn't feel like there was a fight being put up. And I approached my attorney telling the truth. Like, look, I messed up. I had no idea when I was going out committing these bank fraud scams. I had no idea what it was about to lead me to. I didn't know that people would be talking about, all these felonies and stuff like that. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was a crime. I didn't really know what crime I was committing, what I might be charged with, or what I might be looking at. I dang sure didn't think I'd be looking at decades in prison. But while you're in the county jail, you kind of see, the racial disparities. You can see that people with the same exact crime, the same exact circumstance don't always have the same outcome. I would see a lot of people going to court and receiving like different sentencing alternatives, different plea agreements, maybe a felony being dropped to a misdemeanor. But then somebody who looks more like me might go to court and they're coming back from court looking real sad. Like, look, it's ugly for me. So the racial disparities were they were evident from the start. And I was kind of that guy in jail that like, I kited the law library. A kite is when you send a request for information. And I received the sentencing guidelines for the state of Washington. And since I had this, a lot of people in my unit would come to me trying to look at how much time they were going to get. So I would show them, look, you have this many felony convictions. So based on that, if you're found guilty, this is how much time you're looking at. And like for a lot of people who look like me, that would ring true. But I noticed that for a lot of the white guys, who went through the system, they would end up with very favorable circumstances. Not all of them, but a lot of them would end up with very favorable circumstances compared to the people who look more like me. And when I got out of prison, I decided to turn my life around. I got out with the GED at 23 years old. I had no work experience. I had nothing really going for myself, but I knew that I didn't want to go back to prison. So I ended up going to college and getting an education. And then once I'm in college, once again, a lot of the people there don't really look like me. And I'm part of this formerly incarcerated college graduates network where there's, I think, over 1,000 people in 43 states. That's probably grown by now because those are probably outdated numbers. But here in the state of Washington, most of the very successful people who I know, like there's a college professor, I just mentioned Dr. Noel Vest, and then there's another college professor who I know, Dr. Chris Beasley here. He's not from here, but he moved here. There's people like Tara Simmons, there's a lot of people who I know who are white, who are able to get out of prison and build these amazing lives for themselves. But I just don't see a whole lot of that with people of color, period, and especially Black males. There are some of us who've been able to do it, but I feel like our journey is just so much tougher. It's a lot harder, when it comes to going to job interviews and convincing people that we've changed, convincing people that we shouldn't be reduced to the results of our background check. It's a lot more difficult for us. And I know I was only supposed to talk for 10 minutes. I know I'm getting close to that, but what I really just want you guys to take away is that this system should function the same no matter who's going through it. It shouldn't matter what your ethnicity is. It shouldn't matter your socioeconomic status. What should matter is what's best for society. And what's best for society is that you don't commit another crime. And the best way for us to do that is not to make you part of a permanent underclass, for you to be permanently in the margins where you can't find a place to live, you can't find a job. What we need to be doing is addressing the underlying trauma. And we need to be addressing the things that led to the incarceration to begin with. And unfortunately, the way this criminal justice system is set up, it doesn't quite do that. Even when there is programming available in prisons and things like that, it's not available to everyone. And they have a lot of weird rules in place on who can take it. You got to have this certain amount of time left, or you have to have these certain charges. So I just want you guys to know that, look, my experience in the system, it was a unique experience to me and my circumstances, but there's a lot of people who have a lot of similarities, when they look like me. So that's what I got for you guys for my little introduction. I'm looking forward to taking some questions.
Well, good afternoon. Good evening, I guess it's evening here in New Jersey where I am. I'm going to thank you all for the invitation to speak to students on the other side of the United States. Omari, that was wonderful. I thought we had 20 minutes, so I'm going to have to go a little fast. I want to start by saying the Green Monster, that is located on 31 Green Street in Newark, the Newark Municipal Court, which is what they called the Newark Municipal Court. Imagine the place where you go for justice, to be made whole, for neutrality, is considered a monster, a sinister, all-consuming beast by the citizens and people who have to receive services from there. And people weren't wrong for distrusting us. They were absolutely right. The court sat on top of the city jail that had been condemned maybe 20 years prior, and the city continued to use the city jail. The people who had come through the court, the low-hanging fruit, as I like to call them, the mentally ill, homeless person, the drug-addicted prostitute, the young person who had lost their way, were preyed upon. And they were preyed upon because they were given fines and costs and probation that we knew that they couldn't pay when we imposed them. Judges had been reduced to terrible bill collectors, if you could even call them that. And so I would come out during the day. I am currently sitting as a professor of professional practice at Rutgers School of Criminal Justice as I go around the country in world training. But I'd come out on the bench and I'd see a sea of faces, mostly Black, some brown, mostly impoverished, almost all of them suffering from uninterrupted trauma. And we'd begin this cycle of plea deals, as Omari was talking about. A person would get arrested on low-level offenses, because I was a municipal court judge. And I'm talking about drug possession. I'm talking about wandering, which in the state of New Jersey, there's a wandering charge. Wandering with the intention to buy or sell drugs. They don't have to find you with any drugs on you, but they can charge you for being in a high drug trafficking area, which you can call most places in our urban centers. And so we have this justice, this courthouse that's seen as an unjust place. And most of the people who come through it looked like me. And what was justice supposed to do? I got on the bench and I made myself a promise that I was going to do that which I knew was right, whether I got reappointed or not, but that I was going to spend my time there treating people with dignity and respect, because I believed that if people were treated with dignity and respect, it could transform their lives. And it could also transform how justice was given to them. And so what's important to know about me is that I'm the daughter of an African-American garbage man who was born in Harlem, but spent his summers in the segregated South. My father never felt like he had the full rights of citizenship, not even after they signed the Civil Rights Act. Soy la hija de una peluquera dominicana que nació en la República Dominicana, pero que vino para este país, para una vida mejor. And so for those of you who didn't grow up watching telenovelas, I am the daughter of a Dominican beautician who came to this country for a better life for her unborn children. And so my upbringing was a mixture of first generation immigrant values and the civil rights movement and the Black is Beautiful movement, you know. And so when I got on the bench, my parents taught me that you treat everybody you meet with dignity and respect, no matter how they looked, no matter how they spoke, no matter how they dressed. So when I got on the bench, it was important that I saw people, who brought with them. They didn't just show up. For me, court didn't begin at the incident that brought you to court, but all of the things surrounding and why did we get here? And so if we were really going to use justice to impact communities, to make them safer, to make them more livable, then we had to look at more than just giving somebody a fine and jail time. We knew that if we gave a drug addict 90 days in jail on the 91st day, they would still be addicted. And again, I'm looking at a community that predominantly is Black. It's also, has a large Latino population, has a large Portuguese population, but it's also a transit hub. And I was always surprised at how the same people ended up coming through my court, especially with low-level offenses, right? So we opened this large, for the Prudential Center, which had hockey. Now, predominantly Blacks and Latinos do not attend hockey games. They're not big hockey fans. I can say that comfortably. And I would notice that on hockey nights, we would have a flood of police officers in the Central Ward where the arena was. I'd see people drinking in public. I'd see people, I hate to say urinating in public. I'd see people dropping things on the ground. And these were all of the cases that would come for low-level offenders who were Black and brown in my city. But when I would come, I'm like, we had hockey 2 days ago and I didn't get one ticket, one person who attended these places who didn't look like them. And so I was like, oh, so here we are with the selective policing. And also understanding how police operations impact people's contact with the justice system. So our city is also broken down into parts that are predominantly Black, let's say our South Ward, which is predominantly Black, and maybe our North Ward, which is predominantly Latino, our East Ward, which is predominantly Latino, but really a Portuguese section of the town. And what I noticed is that there were a lot of cases that came out of the South Ward, marijuana. Let's say a person would get picked up for marijuana, which now is legal in New Jersey, even though they're having a little front and back, but a person would get stopped, record checked, and when they would record check them, somehow miraculously they'd find a young person or a young man predominantly with marijuana. And I thought to myself, this person, the address obviously is in the South Ward. Do I think that people in the South Ward smoke more marijuana than the people in the North Ward? I don't. But what I do know is that if your police operations are centered and focused in one area of the city, you will have a greater chance of impacting or having a police contact, particularly in a city like Newark that has about 26 law enforcement agencies writing summonses and complaints and tickets. So if you live in a place like Newark, not just work there, your chances of having contact with the police increase exponentially. And so, what happens to a young man like Omari who gets stopped by the police and sent down to the courthouse and pleads guilty on a simple possession of marijuana? That simple marijuana possession case, which is a low level offending misdemeanor, as most states would call it, prevent him from getting federal financial aid, also prevent him from getting certain jobs. And so I had the pleasure of working and having a community court. And so it was the Newark Community Solution. So it helped us provide alternative sentencing for our defendants. So people could come through court, and instead of getting jail automatically, people who would automatically get jail would now get this program where they could do community service and get social services. So when you talk about this uninterrupted trauma, I'm talking about trauma that begins from birth, that continues all the way up until manhood, that continues past that. What happens when you talk about for young women, the sexual assault to prison pipeline? What they found, obviously, is that young women who end up in prison have histories of sexual assault, and that the number of young women of color, particularly Black girls, get forced into the juvenile system quicker. And many of the things that cause them to end up in the juvenile system are things that they do to protect themselves from sexual assault. It's the fighting, it's the truancy, not showing up at school, it's running away from home. And so as a judge, for me, it was very important to bring everything that I was, everything that I knew about community, everything that I knew about people to the bench so that I could have an understanding of what was before me. I was very clear that I didn't work for the police, that the police, if they wanted to bring a case, they had to be able to prove it. I was saying that sometimes judges say, how do you make prosecutors give better offers? And I was like, well, you got to make them try cases, which means that people have to prove their case. We do have a system that is based on plea deals, but the judge has to ensure that before we take a plea, that it is knowing and voluntary. So I can't take a plea if the person doesn't know what they're doing. And so you look at the people who suffer from mental illness, which was such a large portion of people who sat in our courtroom. I have a responsibility to make sure that they understand the process and that they're represented, even if I have to appoint someone if they can't afford it. So those are the things that, for me, ensure that justice is being served, particularly in communities of color where we know people are targeted based on their race and based on the fact that they're poor. And what happens when legislators look and say, oh, I don't like people sleeping in the park. I don't like that. I don't like how it looks. And they go back to their office and they make laws that criminalize a social problem. Because the problem is that the person is sleeping in the park because they don't have a place to live. So why don't they have a place to live? Could it be because the city is on an economic boom and they're building more housing that's now causing people to fall into homelessness? So this law that now causes you to find or me to give them $100 fine. And I'm like, he's got on one shoe. Where am I getting $100 from him? And so it's really thinking about what it means to be a steward of justice. And to be a steward of justice is to look at the justice system and see where there are problems and fix them. And not just accept, well, we've been doing it this way for so long, we might as well continue. Seeing young men and seeing young people as salvageable, even if they're not so young. What does a first-time offender? Now, I say this to you not because I'm saying, oh, be soft on crime, because my nickname in the court in the city of Newark is Judge Pratt Don't Play. And the reality is, because while I'm fair, I'm also going to hold you accountable. And so I can walk in most places in Newark and people are like, oh, there she is. But it's true, because whatever I said I was going to give you, you got. But if you didn't do what I asked you to do, then there was also a consequence. So it's looking, and as people of color, and even if you're not of color, you have to bring your values to your job. You have to do that which is right, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when people are going to talk about you. What do they say? They don't talk about a dead dog. So if nobody's talking about you at your school, that means you might not be working hard enough. But you've got to bring that thing to work. You've got to be in the marketplace and doing that which you know is right. because we don't need more people just, doing the same thing in a system that's not working, and seeing the inequities and seeing the injustice and not taking the time and using their talents to fix them. So I think my 10 minutes is up at this point, but I'm ready for some questions, but to just talk a lot more about what it means to see a system and to be in the system and trying to fix it so that there is equity in the place. It's a big job, but somebody has to begin. Groups of people have to begin to do this.
Thank you both for sharing, and feel free to ask each other questions as well. But for the first question, it's from Maria Teresa that says, "Thank you, Omari. How long was your sentence?"
Yeah, so I ended up, I pled guilty as charged to the 30 felonies. And the plea, my lawyer fought for a drug offender sentencing alternative. And that led, the way that works in the state of Washington is you have, you're sentenced under a range, right? So the judge has options. They don't have to just give you a set amount of time once you're convicted. So I ended up getting a 3-year prison sentence with 3 years of probation, which could have converted to prison time. So it was really 6 years, but half of that was served on the inside, half of that was served on the outside. And I didn't mess up. So the 3 years on the outside never converted to prison time. And I have to admit that the whole drug offender thing, it was more around truth not being a part of this whole process. Like these crimes had nothing to do with drugs, but I got a drug offender sentencing alternative.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question is from Shazzy Van that says, "Thank you, Victoria. What is your opinion on mandatory minimums? Should we abolish them?"
They should be. I think that a judge should have, everyone is different. We need to tailor justice so that it fits every situation specifically. I think that we throw away too many people because of mandatory minimums. And who comes out with these mandatory minimums? Who knows that, this person is going, with 6 years, a person who hasn't even committed a crime is going to be sufficient punishment. I think we have to get over our obsession. We need to be satiated with punishment. We have to make sure we hurt people when in fact, we really need to make sure that they get rehabilitated, because the reality is that, folks, that's why restorative justice is so important, because people will be integrated back into our society. And so we overly punish people for petty crimes, and then we expect them to come back into society and make a contribution. But we've put up all of these collateral consequences, all these barriers for them to live. And so, yes, they should be abolished. If you trust a person enough to make them a judge, you need to trust them enough to make the right decision about sentencing.
Yeah, I think that's too, especially learning from, just lectures, is that like mandatory minimums often punish people of color more often than the majority. So I definitely believe that judges should, have the right to choose without mandatory minimums being there.
Well, just to further, if we understand that people of color are disproportionately pushed through our system, then anything we do in our systems will disproportionately impact them. But again, it's like having somebody on their knees and now you put something else on them. How do you expect people to reintegrate into society? How do people get to have a fair shot at the American dream when minor mistakes cause them to be driven into the justice system? When in neighboring suburbs, Johnny might get picked up with marijuana and he is made to sit at the police station, and the police call his mama or his dad and they come and get him. But Raul sits in an urban space and he gets processed immediately. And what happens to Johnny versus Raul? In Newark, we also have a youth court, which allows the police department to do what's called station house adjustments. Now, I believe that maybe everywhere officers are allowed to do this thing called a station house adjustment. They bring a young person in and they get to decide whether or not to send them to a nonprofit in the community or to process them. And it's who do they decide to process? Who do you see as salvageable? And so when they get sent to the nonprofit, they get sent to our youth court where we have a restorative justice program, and their peers hear their cases, defend them, and they do community service and workshops, and we use positive peer pressure to influence their behavior. But again, this idea that the police have the opportunity to give people an off-ramp, So yes, this is why we have to do this, because the system disproportionately sends people of color through the system.
A lot of people probably think it's fair because it's mandatory, right? So it applies across the board, but they're not taking into the account the plea agreements that are offered. You know how some people would start with the same exact charges, but not everybody's getting the same plea agreements that are offered to them and things like that. There's just a lot of issues with that.
So they never get subjected to the mandatory minimums.
And I think another question that kind of relates to that is for you, Omari, is just kind of what is it like to be in prison surrounded by, people in power, like such as guards that were not people of color? What that experience is like?
For somebody like me, who was super young, I mean, I would say that it was a scary experience at first, because in the state of Washington, everybody goes through Shelton, right? So if you go through Washington Correction Center at Shelton, when you first get there, they don't care what you're charged with. They don't care what your crime was. You might be there on a probation violation and getting out in 30 days, but you might be having a cellmate who's on their way to serve 40 years for murder or something like that. So when you first get there, it's not even really the guards it's just you don't have any clue, who is this person next to you and who's the person in the cell next to you, So your first time in there at a real young age, it can be kind of scary. And just different little things that we go through, like being on the tier. I was at a minimum security camp once I served my sentence. Once I got out of receiving at Shelton, they sent me to a minimum security camp. But I made friends there. We'd be on the tier, laughing, cracking jokes and stuff. And it did seem like we would attract a little bit more attention from the guards just by, laughing or something like that. So it was a pretty negative situation. But there's also some cool guards as well. And it didn't really matter if they were white or not. There's some guards who are a little bit more understanding. I know I had gotten myself in what was the situation? I was like out of bounds or something like that, where you're supposed to be in certain areas. There's other areas you can't go in. And a white guard had caught me out of bounds and he just had to talk with me and let me go. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend like every interaction with the white corrections officer is going to be a bad one, but it would make you feel a lot more comfortable with the people who your life is in their hands, look a little bit more like you. Actually, I remember having a medical situation, and I passed out twice, in the unit. And then I had these white COs, surrounding me when I woke up. And they just sent me there. They didn't really seem to be too concerned about me. And sometimes I just wonder, do they look at me as a human being? Because a human being who just passed out twice, where are the doctors? I should be getting some type of treatment like they would want. But instead, I just kind of sat there and they gave me some water. And then I was back in my bunk, that same night. So I really didn't feel like, I suffered a lot from that based on the seal. I didn't have a lot of negative interactions, but there were some little things that stuck out to me, especially that medical situation. I feel like I should have got some type of medical attention. I still don't know what was wrong, what happened that day.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. So the next question is from Jack Jarvis, and it's for Judge Pratt. And Jack asked, do you believe the way that policing has changed in Camden, New Jersey should be implemented across the country, especially given the amount of people calling for police reform currently?
I just want to start say as to the last question, mandatory minimums have been repealed on certain charges, and I think crack cocaine is one of them. It has been quite successful. I believe what they've done is that they've taken their county police force and they're using it. They've been quite successful, and if you can replicate a success like Camden's having right now, because Camden went from being the murder capital of the world, and it's a tiny place, to being very far down. I don't even know if it's on the list anymore. So if people are having success with it and it would work, then yes, I think what some of the concerns are is the pushback from the police unions, because it dismantles local police forces. So whether there's trust in the local police force is a question. So again, I guess my answer is if you can replicate what they've done in Camden in your environment, then absolutely. But I don't know that it would work everywhere.
So you're saying just the area wise, it would depend on if they could implement or not.
Yeah, I think at least it looks like if they could implement it in a way where you could increase public trust, because most of policing is successful if the community trusts the police. If there's this interaction, you can't have a community that doesn't trust the police at all and expect crimes to be solved. To expect people, so I'll talk about procedural justice in that. Procedural justice is this concept that says if people believe that they are treated with dignity and respect and fairly by the justice system, not only does it increase the public's trust in the system, but it increases compliance with the law and with court orders. That means it reduces crimes because people believe that the authority is a legitimate authority. So people don't obey the law because they're afraid of the consequence. They believe and respect the law because they believe that the person who's telling them to do something has legitimacy and is really a person who should be telling them what to do. So when we're looking at policing, we have to look at all of that and what the community, how they feel about their police force. And if there's no trust, then you can't have a safe community. You won't have a safe community.
Thank you.
I think those things are spreading more and more, where law enforcement can make a referral to a nonprofit. Like I've heard of a program here, I think it might be at South Center Mall, where if a young person is caught stealing, shoplifting, they'll be referred to an organization called GEM, for example. There's also law enforcement assisted diversion with some drug crimes as well, where rather than prosecuting this person for being a drug addict, we're going to kind of refer them to get some help. So that stuff is spreading a little bit.
Perfect. Okay, so now we have a question from Noel Vest that says, thank you both for your insight. Question to both of you, what are some solutions at the systemic level to address some of the problems that you both highlighted?
Oh, there's so many.
So for me,
go ahead, you go and then let's go back and forth. No, you go first.
My honest belief is that this is such an adversarial system by design that this adversarial nature of the system has to go away. And is it the way it's designed, is it going to go away? I'm very pessimistic when it comes to that. So we need more of this law enforcement assisted diversion, where people are getting in trouble and being referred to people who help rather than make it worse, people who don't add on to, the trauma, people who don't just make things worse for the individual who needs to make change. And like I say, that it doesn't only help them. If you take somebody who has an addiction and they're out committing robberies, for example, to support their addiction, you might send them to prison and they get out to no opportunities and have to go straight back to robbing people because it's all they know and that's their comfort zone. But if we can actually treat the underlying trauma, we have to treat the addiction, but you have to realize the addiction is not the root cause. The addiction is the symptom. So we have to treat what caused the addiction. We have to get down to probably going back to people's childhoods and things that were completely out of their control, where they might have been a victim first before they ever victimized anyone. And until the system is about doing that, then I don't know if these problems will be solved, because incarceration, I've heard several people credit going to prison or being incarcerated for changing their life. And I always challenge that when they do it. I'm like, what is it about prison that allowed you to change? And they'll identify things like being out of my old neighborhood, being clean and sober, having an opportunity to think and be clear-minded. And I'm like, so is there possibly a better place to send you, or a better place where you could have done that outside of prison? A place where you might not have felt like your life was on the line, and a place where you didn't have to deal with the politics and things like that, being away from your loved ones and your family. I feel like there's just way better environments where people can grow and develop. If we're about preventing crime, if we're about making sure that people can build a life for themselves, then we just need to change this from this adversarial system that wants to punish people to we're now a system of support. We're a system of making victims whole, making the perpetrators whole, making everybody whole, so that we don't end up in this situation again.
And I agree in terms of this whole adversarial system, and which is why I'm such a proponent of these alternative sentencing programs, the drug courts, the domestic violence courts, these youth courts, these spaces where you can, and these community courts, where it's not an adversarial system, where you have the prosecutor, the public defender, a probation person, and the court coordinator, or you have social workers on site at the courthouse, and the judge sitting down and thinking about what is the best plan for this person so that they can be put back into society, and they can be whole, so that they can be healthy, so that they can get clean, so they can make a contribution to their families and their communities. How do they make their communities whole? A person who is nodding out on a corner is causing a harm to that community, right? So how do we do that? Now you go back and you do community service in that space. How do you give back to this? Because you still have something to give, but how do we get you to drug treatment? How do we get you a bed? So this is the first time we know that relapse is a part of addiction, but we have to get people into spaces where they can get better, so that we can get these families and entire communities. I mean, it's easy to punish people and then let them go out, and like you said, they're back on that same corner immediately. It's always interesting looking at I would look at the records of drug dealers and seeing intergenerational incarceration, where the father would come out because he was a drug addict. But when I would look at his record, it would be drug distribution, drug distribution. And I'd say, wow, you made a lot of money in the 80s, because that's when people made a lot of money drug dealing. And then you see that prison sentence. And when they come out of prison, the charges are possession, 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 because now the drug dealer has become the drug user. And then you see the son waiting for his father. And I'm like, wow, your criminal record looks exactly like your dad's did before he went to prison. And so it's this continuous cycle that we have to stop. We have to stop. And so we do have to change. We have to offer what we call these off-ramps. So you've made a mistake. How do I get you into a place that you're not going to continue to be in these streets? How do I ensure? Because we know that poverty is not just poverty, it's inadequate health care. It's not having an adequate education system. It's not having access to money, or, poverty is about the lack of something. So this idea that we continue to punish people for not having. So we punish them for stealing food, right? We punish them for not having a place to live, right? We punish them for not having these things. So what do we need to do to make, to balance, so that there's equity, financial equity, that there's places for people. People will do anything to feed their children. So if we take that away from them, then we were just driving them into the justice system anyway. So really looking at the system holistically and stopping these off-ramps, like feeding people, homeless people who start to scream and yell and get aggressive with the officers. My officers learned right early on, do we have prisoner food in the back? Offer them a sandwich. As soon as you offer a homeless, but they're always hungry. And it calms them down immediately. Now you don't have to use force. Now you don't have to be nasty. We'd have homeless people come into the court. Yeah, no, I'm just here to see the officer. Why? Because the officer would go in his pocket and give him $5 and he could get a hot dog from the truck. That just stopped him from panhandling and probably knocking someone in the head or going into a store to shoplift. So the courthouse became a resource for folks. So we really need to retool these spaces that we have for punishment.
Thank you both for that. So the next question is from Natasha Crisp, and it says, Omari, how did your contact with the system impact your journey looking and obtaining a higher education?
I would say, for one, it kind of limited my options. Initially I went to school to get my associates in human services, substance abuse. I wanted to be a drug and alcohol counselor because my parents were in addiction. I grew up, I've experienced foster care, I've experienced neglect, abandonment, chronic instability, going to over 15 schools growing up. I never climbed out of poverty, never went to, the same school or lived in the same houses for very long. So I wanted to help kids not have to go through that by helping their parents with their addictions. But with 30 felonies on my record, I never filled out the application to become licensed. Even though I earned my degree, I see my classmates going to work in the field shortly after, we get started. You got to get your trainee hours to be a drug and alcohol counselor. So I'm watching my classmates get to go to work, and I'm just scared to ever fill out the background check, because if they deny me, then what does that say for my education now? Like, I'm in school, my identity has transformed. I don't consider myself a felon, I'm a college student. So if I fill out this form and they tell me, no, we're not going to let you work in this field, that's over for me at this point. So I decided since my degree came with a direct transfer agreement, I decided forget going to work in that field. Because I was on probation for 3 years when I got out. So I graduated with my associate's degree, still on probation, like feeling like my options were super limited. So I decided to just continue my education. Let's put a little bit more time behind me. And that's what led to me going to the University of Washington, where I earned 2 bachelor's degrees, and then after that, I went into grad school, earned my master's degree. And in grad school, my research method was called autoethnography. And that's where the researcher becomes the focus of the research. So I was able to look at my experiences transitioning from prison to college, and I developed a prison to college workshop to help other people do similar things. And then that just led to a whole nother life for me, where I ended up teaching at South Seattle College. I ended up, working for the ACLU of Washington. Pretty much my past, my background, the fact that I had been in trouble before and turned it around, that was what allowed me to make such a great life for myself after graduating from college. So it really stopped me in certain ways. Like also when I first went to grad school, my first choice was to get a master's in social work. Once again, to work with disadvantaged youth and things like that. But I inquire about going into that program. They tell me you'll never be able to complete the internships because of your background. Nobody's going to let you do the internships. So that led to me getting my master's in interdisciplinary studies. And, the guy overstepped his boundaries. I could have gotten my master's in social work. He didn't know what he was talking about. I know people who have done it, but I didn't know this at the time. But it was just part of my destiny. I needed him to do that for me. If he did not do that, I wouldn't be here talking to you right now. I would have never written any of my books. I would have never done public speaking, period. I would have never done any of the stuff related to giving back to, formerly incarcerated people and working with youth who are system involved. Before, like my research methods and stuff like that, I was looking at what's the educational impacts for kids served by low-income housing and things like that. So once I developed this prison to college workshop, it actually just provided a great purpose for my life. So while it harmed me in certain ways, I would say it has been a major benefit in other ways.
Perfect. And so our next question is for both of you, and it's from Stephen Daly Larson. And Stephen says, what are first moves to make our penal systems better at rehabilitation and preparation for life?
You want me to go first again?
Well, yeah, just the question was a little more specific, but okay, yes, go first again.
So for me, I feel like, we have to let's take the fixing people out of the hands of the system, like the system has very limited tools when it comes to actually addressing people's root issues. So let's keep them in the community, so there's organizations such as like Community Passageways who has youth who are charged with serious felonies, and they're taking these cases out of the court's hands. And they're like, look, give them to us. We're a nonprofit organization. We're in the community. We're going to get them out here speaking, sharing their stories and doing good work and finding value in their voice and learning about their skill sets and finding their passions. So I feel like the more we can involve the community, the more that we're not institutionalizing people, the more that we're not hitting people with unpayable fines and fees and things like that, I feel like that's when we're going to really see a change, because the court in court, like I say, they have very limited tools at their disposal. So they need to tap into the community and let the community, be responsible for protecting their own, right? We come from these communities. So let's provide funding to the nonprofits. Like when people talk about defunding the police, for example, there's some people that's just, oh my God, don't defund the police. What are we going to do with no police? But defunding the police is not about getting rid of the police. It's about reallocating some of the money that's going into punishing people and over policing, and let's give it to these community organizations who can really make a difference in their lives.
Well, once again, my plug for community courts and why they are important. In Newark, when they decided, when the organization, the Center for Court Innovation came they were like, we're going to have community meetings. And they had community meetings throughout the city and asked the residents, what do you want justice to look like? And surprisingly enough, people didn't say, we want them to have harsher sentences. We want you to give people harsher sentences when they come down to the courthouse. We want you to keep them locked up. In fact, what they said is, we want that young boy who's out there on the corner selling drugs, we want him to have opportunity to work. We want him to go back to school. We want the drug addict who's not now in front of my house, I want him to get drug treatment. And so this idea of partnering with a nonprofit that then pulls together all of the nonprofits in the community, or as I say, the poverty pimp nonprofit organizations that have been doing this work for years, and partnering with the courts so that I now can sentence a person who would otherwise get jail now gets individual counseling sessions, group counseling sessions, but I can send them to a community partner for mental health treatment. And so when they're done with their sentence with the court, which is community service and these other things, they now can go straight to this organization that will continue to help them. It's sending them to the soup kitchen in the community to help serve people in their community. But when they run out of food at their house, they know where they can get this food. They know where they can go and get signed up and get taken to drug treatment. They know where to go with the organizations that do gang truces that can actually quash a beef between gang members, and they can stay alive. And so this happens with the court having the actual person who has a sentence. And instead of me just wasting this opportunity by sending him to jail, I now use my accountability. So like you talked about your sentence, that's 3 years. There's a suspended jail sentence on that. In some instances, the cases are getting dismissed because they're cases that, they're first offenders, but there are cases that you can just use the power and the weight of the court to make people help themselves and get them connected to services that already exist. I mean, one year we gave the city of Newark about 17,000 hours of community service, working in community gardens. What are community gardens? They're lots that residents take up and keep clean. We would send people out there to help them plant vegetables, and then people in the community can have access to free vegetables in a place like Newark that at the time was a food desert. You couldn't find a supermarket, or the supermarket was fairly far, or you had to rely on the value of the quality of the vegetables at the bodega. And so again, using these community resources to reconnect these people who are coming through the justice system, using the universities. We used to use Rutgers had a program where we would send guys who dropped out, guys and women, young women who dropped out of high school, and they'd get an internship and be paid and get their GED. So there were like 20 GED programs in the city, and I forced people to go, yeah, you got to go, because if not, you're going to keep coming through this system. And so having a space where the judge cares enough about you to force you to do what you're supposed to do for yourself. And I tell you, having those resources also changed how many of the police officers policed, because they knew, look, I'm gonna bring you down there, but I know you're gonna be able to get help. We had one officer call the social worker and say, I'm here with a guy who's got a green envelope. If he's got a green folder, that means he's in Judge Pratt's program. And if you give me his mom's name, I'll drop him off at the hospital. If not, I'm gonna arrest him because he's either really high or not. Now, most police officers don't take people to the hospital. I can't sit on this body. If I take him down to the hospital, I got to sit on him. So I'm just going to send him down to you at the courthouse. So I'm going to arrest him. And right, so that obviously it makes no sense. But this idea that the police officer knew that there was a resource at the courthouse that could get the mother out to the hospital. I'm just going to drop him off at the hospital, let his mom come see about him, right? So now you have the officers have additional tools to use in their policing of the community. So they're not always thinking like, oh, I don't have to bring them down to the precinct and write this up and file a complaint for public drunkenness or anything like that. So I think that's how we begin to do, by really letting the community save itself, because they have the answers. Too often people come in and want to tell the community, this is how you're going to do, this is how we save you. And you have no understanding of what this community looks like or the history of these communities. So, and not being afraid of the community. That's another thing. People come into these communities and they're afraid of the folks they're supposed to be working with. So being willing to see people, I just keep saying this, seeing people as salvageable, that they are worthy, that they are quality, and that they deserve another opportunity.
Thank you. And I think you both make a good point, because often I think about, being at a university right now is like, there's so many students that come from different places that have so many different backgrounds that could, help create this community program for, ex-offenders, offenders. And we don't often use universities enough to build that community. We think universities are communities, but then we don't use them in other ways that can be helpful for other people. So I think you both make great points on that one. And so this question is from John.
Sorry, can I just say something about the university piece? Sometimes I'd come out in my little court out on the bench and I'd say, we have about 3 universities at the in Newark. And I'm like, am I teaching a college course from my courtroom today? Because of the aggressive policing, police forces on campus. So this idea, and I would call the presidents like, these are your students. If you've got a marijuana problem on campus, you need to deal with this as part of your honor code and counseling. So again, driving college students into the justice system as well has been has been a problem. It's really a problem. So, and again, if there's, and particularly students of color coming through, that they're college students, and they get sent right down to the city court. So.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so this question is from John Schneider, and John says, thank you both. Judge Pratt, how did you handle non-compliant offenders with either technical or substantive violations of your sentence?
How you want to know how I became Judge Pratt don't play is what it is. I started working in a court where people got jail all the time. They got jail for money they owed. They got jail for not coming back to court. They got jail for everything. And I had to figure out, how do I create an environment where how do you punish people? How do you make jail a legitimate form of punishment? I want it to be the thing you don't want to get. And when you get it all the time for no reason, or for like really small reasons, then what do you care what people do? Because there's no justice being done at the courthouse anyway. So what do I care? And so what I did was that I made people value their liberty. So when I first started, people would come to court and get arrested. I'd let them go home. The police officers would talk bad about me, like, oh, this new judge, she doesn't know what she's doing. I'd let people go home 2 times. And then when I became a judge, I would never, for some reason, I never forgot a face or conversation. I mean, never forgot a face or conversation. So they would go home, and then maybe on the 3rd or 4th time, then I'd hold them to a bail. And then they'd sit in there like, wait a minute, like, I can't believe you're going to hold me. And it's because you have violated this relationship of trust, which is, I let you go home, you come back. If you don't come back, then you get this. But also being very clear about what those consequences look like. So 1, giving people an opportunity to do the right thing, but also when they weren't doing the right thing, holding them accountable for it. And then the community, urban communities are wonderful, because it's like urban myths, spread like wildfire. So they're like, oh no, Judge Pratt don't play, so make sure you show up to court. And people would talk about me on the bus, and they would talk about, oh, no, if the judge says show up, because she's actually being fair and she's going to help you. So that, a lot of it was treating people respectfully as well, like knowing what the consequences. If you don't come to court, I'm sending the fugitive squad to pick you up, and they only work from 1 to 6 in the morning. So they're going to come to your door at that time. And again, making a note. We had this conversation the last time you came here. And so then people just started coming, and they also saw value. They saw that they were valued. They saw that they were treated respectfully. And they saw that if they came to court with a problem, we would try to help them. So I think that it just became this, it shifted the culture of the courthouse, but it also shifted how the community saw the courthouse as well. Just show up, man. I used to see defendants take people out in the hallway and say, yo, she's trying to help you, stop. Whatever it is you're doing. And so again, using the community to save itself.
Thank you. So we're about close to time. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll wrap up. But this question could be addressed for either of you. And it's just, maybe you can elaborate on, how would either of you like to see racial disparities fixed, and what would fix them within the criminal justice system?
For me personally, the biggest racial disparity that I want to see fixed doesn't involve the people who are being prosecuted, the people who are being arrested. The biggest racial disparity that I want to see fixed is the fact that there aren't enough people of color who are the operators of the system. We need more Black and brown police officers. We need more Black and brown prosecutors. We need more Black and brown judges. And I'm speaking about the Pacific Northwest because that's where my experiences are. So I know in other places it could be a lot different, but here, I feel like once we get more diversity, in the courtroom, from the people working there, in the jails and things like that, then these other racial disparities can somewhat sort themselves out. Like if we get more police of color who aren't just being placed in communities of color to over police them, then maybe those biases and things like that result from coming from a place where you can't really relate to this person or understand them, so you feel threatened. That stuff I feel like it can kind of go away, So I feel like that's where it all starts, is just getting more people who are employed by the system, who come from these marginalized communities, people who may have even grew up in poverty, who aren't scared of people who grew up in poverty, who recognize that, look, these are human beings, like people who aren't going to see them as offenders, but going to see them as people. I feel like that's a good place for us to start.
I believe that we have to stop allowing first we have to acknowledge that there are racial disparities. The system itself has to acknowledge that there are racial disparities in the court system. Not just, oh, these are the people who commit more crimes than other folks. We also have to stop letting poverty, the lack of an education, lack of health care, mental illness, emotional illness, and trauma be the drivers for why people end up coming through the justice system. We also have to check confirmation bias and listen to information that goes beyond those things that confirm what we already believe about what we see in the people before us, and creating exit ramps, giving people an opportunity to not come through the system, or if they do come through the system, also helping the underlying cause of why they offend, needing to understand why people offend and giving them assistance with that. Because until we do that, we will never stop the cycle of incarceration, and also looking at laws. Why are we incarcerating people for this? Why are we criminalizing? So most of it is going to be decriminalizing social ills. So much of it is going to be just decriminalizing social ills. This is a social problem. It doesn't belong in the courthouse. And if it's going to stay in the courthouse, you're going to give the judge tools to deal with social problems, like having social workers and case managers in the courthouse, and money so that we can send people to drug treatment, as opposed to just sending them to jails or to mental health facilities so that they can get assistance.
Well, thank you both. So just to wrap up tonight, I just want to say thank you to the Foley Institute for hosting this event. And again, a special thank you to Judge Pratt and Omari for participating and sharing all your knowledge with us. To all of those who attended, thank you. And I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.